Hello, and welcome to Under 1000. My name's Thomas Flower, and each episode I'll read you a new piece of flash fiction. All of the stories are 1,000 words or less. Today, I'll be reading The Unsayable. Please be aware that this episode deals with themes of death, so if that's likely to upset you or anyone you're listening with, then you might want to skip this one. They were a perfect couple. Everybody said so. So cute together, and it seemed like their personalities were the precise complements of each other as well. The more superstitious of their friends claimed it must be destiny. But despite how outwardly wonderful everything seemed, there was one problem that not even they realized until later. It was like some kind of curse. They didn't know whether it was simply a cruel trick of nature, or a vengeful magic spell cast by someone jealous and vindictive. But still, whatever the cause, it came to haunt them soon enough. Each month, every month, another word would be gone from their minds. At first, it wasn't noticeable, or a problem. After all, how often does anybody really talk about lycanthropy or discuss the uses of a probang? For the first few years, they lost terms without even realizing it. There were times when they would hold a word on the tip of their tongue and be unable to remember it without some assistance, but they each chalked this up to typical forgetfulness. She first noticed a problem when she could no longer remember the word mother. He first realized something was wrong when he couldn't recall what to call those animals that live in fields and make milk. The fortunate thing was that they did not seem to forget words which the other remembered, and so, as they noticed the holes in their vocabularies, each became reliant on the other to construct lists of words which they had lost. At first, they took to carrying these lists with them, glancing at them when they needed a reminder of the terms they couldn't recall. But as the years passed, and the lists became longer and longer, it was simply not practical to be carrying them around. They tried to just keep lists in the desk at home, but eventually it was too cumbersome to wade through the many different words, and so they each gave up. Her first, and then him a few months later. The strangest thing about it all was that once these words were gone, they were gone for good. It would seem reasonable to assume that they would be able to find the words they were looking for, and then hold them in their minds for a few minutes, but it was simply not possible. The only way for them to recall the word was to say or write it directly after reading or hearing it. If they glanced away, or listened to something else, the word would simply be gone again, banished from their minds. Of course, they tried various tricks to overcome this bizarre obstacle. He tried learning words he had forgotten in another language, hoping that he could fill the gaps with substitutes at least. She, meanwhile, tried to construct some sort of language of her own making, combining sounds to represent the concepts she was unable to vocalize anymore. In both cases, the attempt failed. It was not just that they had forgotten the words in their native tongues, but rather that the very idea, the very concept behind the word, had somehow been removed from their brains and forbidden to return. There was no way around it. Once they were gone, and as even more time went by, they became extremely limited in what they could remember. Fortunately, the pattern of their forgetfulness remained. What she had forgotten, he seemed to remember, and what he had lost, she had retained. A small comfort. And so, they began to cling to each other for support, constructing sentences together, sometimes one word at a time. It was a strange kind of life, but it seemed to work, sort of. After all, there was not much else they could do. They had tried every solution they could otherwise think of at this point, both medical and of their own creation. Nothing had worked, and so they were out of options. plausible, offbeat, superficial, obey, eventually, as they grew into truly old age together, they became so utterly reliant on one another that they began to act almost like two people living in one mind. They were inseparable, not in a romantic sense, but purely out of practicality. Increasingly, their ability to function in day-to-day life, their survival, became entirely bound up in being with each other. Of course, there were those who thought of it as romantic anyway. They saw something beautiful in this strange tragedy, and some even secretly wished that they could have such closeness with their loved ones. It was always unclear what the couple in question thought of it. They seemed to have different opinions, but as they were unable to express them without one another, they never truly told anyone what they each thought. At the very end of it all, he was the first to go. And she, now stranded in a world of words, with only half a vocabulary available to her, had a great deal of distress mixed up in her devastation. People suggested plans for her that might make life more comfortable, but most were rather drastic, and it's hard to get proper consent from a woman who can no longer remember how to say yes. They had to make a decision for her. It was never very clear whether she was happy with it or not. Friends say she's still out there now. She doesn't appear in public much anymore. Apparently, she lives as a mute and rarely ventures outside without a great deal of help. But as little as it happens, it does still happen. Maybe you'll see her yourself one day, an old woman surrounded by friends, looking confused. If you do, give her a smile. Kindness is vital for someone like her, and it's the one thing she can be sure to still understand. Thank you for listening to Under 1000. I'm your host, Thomas Flower. To follow the show online, look for Under 1000 Pod on Twitter or Facebook, or check out the website at under1000pod.com. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon, go to patreon.com/under1000pod, where you can sign up to read each month's stories in advance, as well as to have a thank you be read during these credits. The theme music is an instrumental version of In Between Days by Nick Tate and the Sharks. To hear the full song and more from the same EP, go to Nick Tate, Nictate, and thesharks.bandcamp.com, or search for them on your favourite streaming platform. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and that you'll join me again next time for some more super short fiction.